Is Daddy Belcher a bad dad?
Wanted to open up the restaurant that ruined all our lives. I guess they wanted that life. Oh, yeah.
Bob, don't listen to them. You are a little paralyzed by indecision right now, and it's cute, but we have made it this far.
I would argue, no. I actually think Bob Belcher is arguably one of the best representations of a dad that we've seen in the adult cartoon universe. But the show doesn't always treat Bob as the good dad he is. More so, I don't think Bob himself always realizes that he's a good dad. In fact, more often than not, Bob's parenting appears to be critiqued rather than praised, and that probably gets to him. So, whilst it's obvious to us as an audience that Bob is a really great dad, it isn't often communicated to Bob. I actually got the inspiration to make this video during my 20th rerun of watching season 16, episode 1, which features the kids making a song about how Bob and the restaurant basically ruined their lives. So let's start off with chapter 1, why Bob is a good dad. In the adult cartoon universe, it's pretty obvious that Bob Belcher beats all the other dads by a long shot. The only dad who I think comes close to Belcher levels of fatherhood is Hank Hill, and even then, I don't think it's that close. I think Bob exceeds Hank's parenting by a long shot, but I'll let you argue about that in the comments. Now, people have already made amazing videos about this, so I won't go into too much detail, but in my eyes, the best thing that Bob brings to the table is his ability to disrupt the trope of fathers not taking their children seriously and not seeing them as equals in the adult cartoon universe. Importantly, Bob disrupts the precedents that other adult cartoons set, including our beloved King of the Hill, that there needs to be a patriarchal hierarchy for a household to function. If anyone's in charge of Bob's household, it's Luis. Jokes aside, Bob constantly makes an effort to see his kids as equals, prioritizing their opinions and accepting their beliefs. Bob also goes outside of his comfort zone to grow on his children's behalf. He's actively doing as much as he can to be a better dad. Like in season 15, episode 7, when Bob comes out of his comfort zone and confronts his fear of boogie boarding so he can share a bonding moment with Luis. Also, let's not forget about season 4, episode 17, one of my favorite episodes because it's completely unhinged and you can just tell someone was like maybe high when they wrote it. When Bob dresses up as a horse for most of the episode to save Tina's figure from an adult fan club of the equestrianauts. In the words of this Reddit comment that I really appreciated, the reason Bob is a good dad is because Bob is a man who has truly learned to pick his battles. He understands his wife's madness, and when she has her heart set on something, he knows when it's time to get out of her way. He has a similar relationship with Luis. They seem to have a kind of mutual respect where he allows her a lot of freedoms and only uses authority when he absolutely has to. I guess what I'm trying to say is that while they're all well written, Bob is probably the most fully developed character. He's got a lot of sensitivity and awareness that becomes apparent when you pay attention to the subtleties of how he treats his family. So what's the deal with the idea that Bob could possibly be a bad dad? Let me say, it's not coming from me. It's coming from Bob. As I mentioned at the start, I was inspired to make this video from season 16, episode 1's introduction. One thing I want to be clear about is that I do think that Linda and the kids know that Bob is a really good dad, and I'll talk about that at the end of the video. But I also think that the show has an interesting habit of making Bob feel like he's a bad dad. So, chapter 2. Let's discuss why Bob thinks that he's a bad dad. I think one of Bob's biggest insecurities about whether or not he's a good dad is his final instability and the situation of the restaurant. In the opening scene to episode 16, it probably doesn't help that the kids sometimes complain about how poor the family is. And part of that problem does reflect on Bob's guilt about whether or not he should have opened a restaurant. The restaurant is the crux, I think, of Bob's relationship to his children. In fact, in season 15, episode 9, Bob complains to Linda that maybe he should have worked in a bank, an insecurity made worse when he meets another dad who does work in a bank and seems to be doing financially better than Bob. But I think that this is a reality that most parents face. Wondering if they're making enough to make their children happy, wondering if they've made the right choices, wondering if their career is enough to fulfill their family's needs. And on the other end of that question, parents who tend to make a lot of money tend to worry that they aren't around enough for their children. A problem that Bob definitely does not face. In fact, maybe he's around too much. Tied up in this conversation of fiscal uncertainty, Bob also confronts the fact that the kids have to work throughout the show. And on the one hand, he often gets frustrated at the kids for not working enough. In fact, one of the most critiqued aspects of Bob and Linda's parenting is the fact that they have kids who work in the restaurant, and it's an obvious tension throughout the show. In season 1, for instance, Bob gets upset at Tina for not wanting to work in the restaurant enough as she becomes invested in sexy fight dancing. But later on in season 3, episode 3, Bob confronts Linda about having the kids work in the restaurant and feels guilty about it. So he fires them momentarily. As a side note, the funniest thing about this episode is that whilst Bob feels like he's a bad dad for making the kids work, they insist on working, showing that sometimes you can feel like a bad parent, but your kids might feel the exact opposite. And again, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more at the end of the video. Bob goes through feelings of emotional grief about having his kids work, feeling as though he's becoming his father. But the kids ultimately end up working for a much more exploitative couple who end up making the kids smuggle drugs under the guise of blueberries. In the more recent seasons, the kids seem to find a better balance with Bob about working, like in season 15, episode 19, where the kids negotiate getting Saturdays off for their SMAC, Saturday Morning Adventure Kids. In all of these cases, it's clear to us as an audience that Bob has the kids work to teach them responsibility and to make ends meet. As an adult, it's kind of frustrating to see the kids maybe take the restaurant for granted, but on the other end of the spectrum, I guess they shouldn't have to work in the restaurant. I personally tolerate this part about Bob, though. As a child to immigrants, I understand how hard it is to make ends meet and how sometimes you do have to work as a kid. But I also understand why Bob struggles with asking the kids to work. And I also understand why people dislike it about him. Let me know what you think in the comments about that. Another instance where Bob seems to think that he's a bad dad is in season 15, episode 20, where he once again reflects on his own relationship with his dad. Bob feels incredibly guilty over not flying a kite with his kids, and he overcompensates for it by almost drowning. I'm sure there are other cases, but these are just a few examples of how Bob seems to struggle to confront with the idea that he is or is not a good dad. I actually think that this is the most realistic part about Bob as a father. As someone who is a certified member of the Good Dad Club, I love my dad. I will say that when I tell my dad that I think he's a good dad, I think it makes him uncomfortable. I don't know, because I'm not a parent, but I do think there is some hardship in constantly wondering if you're doing right by the people who depend on you. So on that note, do the kids actually think Bob is a bad dad, or do they think that he's a good dad? Chapter 3. What does Bob's family think of Bob? Whilst no one has pointedly told Bob he's a bad dad, to my knowledge, a lot of people on Reddit seem to think that Bob is underappreciated and maybe even taken for granted. For instance, on a post about season 5, episode 10, people were really upset that Bob's family took him for granted, arguing that Bob often has to sacrifice more than he gets. In season 16, episode 1, and in the song I used at the start of the video, I personally think that the kids have frustrations towards the restaurant, but not Bob, which is totally okay. It's one thing to be upset about your socioeconomic position, and it's a completely other thing to dislike your parents for it. Throughout the show, I think that the restaurant failing is often conflated as Bob failing as a dad, or even as a husband. But the reality is that the two things are entirely separate and should be treated as such. However, it's clear Bob's family thinks he's an amazing dad, and I do too. And regardless of how much Bob might struggle to confront fatherhood, he's a very beloved family man. In fact, it's heavily alluded to throughout the show that Louise considers Bob to be her hero, and that she wants to maybe even take over the restaurant one day. The family unity very clearly depends on Bob throughout the show, and Bob has special moments with all of the family where it's very clear to the audience that he's a wonderful father and a good man. It's also clear that Bob is comparatively better than, say, Jimmy Pesto, who I know that we all hate. So, what do you make of Bob? Do you consider him a good dad or a bad dad? And do you think that he considers himself to be a good dad or a bad dad? How would you feel if you were Bob?
All right, listen, you're my children, and I love you, but you're all terrible at what you do here. And I feel like I should tell you, I'd fire all of you if I could.
Bob.
All right, hands in. Tina, don't put your hand in.
What?
All right, sell some burgers!
Some burgers.